which would have been scary.
Well, there were fire extinguishers in there, 2 in each bay, and we would have fired them off. And we weren't that far from Jakarta at that stage. We could have turned back and landed there in probably under 20 minutes.
So you'd gone into this cloud, and you're racing along at hundreds of miles an hour into this very corrosive ash?
No, as it happens, it wasn't corrosive. It was benign. Obviously, it gave us a sandblasting. For the trauma that we went through in those 14, 15 minutes while the engines weren't going, and the whole thing was only about 40 minutes from start to finish. And for all the trauma that we went through, and it did frighten us, I suppose, when we looked at the aeroplane afterwards, certainly in darkness, it was a disappointment, really, because it ought to have been in a mess. But all that had happened was the paintwork and the decal on one side of the aeroplane had sort of been worn away by the ash sandblasting the aircraft. And, of course, it damaged the windscreens and the landing lights and all sorts of things like that.
It's normal, or it happens every now and then, that an aircraft loses one engine, but losing 4 is, statistically, it's almost impossible. It's almost impossible, usually, isn't it? The numbers, the odds against it.
All I'd known up until then was a cock-up, when an aeroplane had been using, all 4 engines had been being fed from one tank and letting that tank run dry. And that was one of my first thoughts were, silly boys, we've let all the fuel run out in one tank or something, but it wasn't that at all.
And I guess you're getting instrumentation readings that are would be affected by what was happening around the aircraft?
Well, yeah, actually in the glide, and that's what it was. I mean, we didn't fall out of the sky, we glided the aircraft. There were all sorts of funny things going on that made it very, very difficult to understand. There were things working that we'd been told wouldn't be working, and vice versa, and there were all the electronic readouts were reading gibberish. They weren't reading anything. And the number of instruments I had to use to fly the aircraft were reduced to an absolute minimum. There was a 50-knot discrepancy in the airspeed indicators, because to get these engines going, Rolls-Royce had said you have to be below 29,000 feet and flying at between 250 and 270 knots indicated, and that's what I was doing on my side. And unfortunately, on my co-pilot side, at one stage, the speed was reading 320 knots. Now, when you've got a choice between two things, if you've got my sort of luck, especially on the golf course, you get it wrong. So you have to believe one and then believe the other, or try one and then try the other.
So when all this is going on, what happens within the crew? There's 3 of you there. Yep. Obviously, you have to work out responsibilities and apportion tasks.
We were lucky in British Airways because, as I said before, I had done a 4-engine failure detail on the simulator. Every 2 years, you would, in fact, do this detail again. We all had, the 3 of us had, in fact, practiced this 4-engine failure procedure many, many times. However, when it happened for real, it wasn't much like the simulator detail. There were lots and lots of differences, and those differences do cause confusion.
I think one thing that happened, which may have been a bonus, as I've read it, and that is the failure of your co-pilot's oxygen mask actually led to you getting out of the cloud quicker. Is that how it worked?
I think it probably did,
Which is sort of quite amazing, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it was really. I mean, he was the only one on the flight deck that smoked at that time. And we're going back 25 years, it was much more common.
Yes.
And we'd been lucky in that the autopilot had stayed in, which it didn't do on the simulator, and they still don't understand why it had stayed in to this day. But it had stayed in, so we had an extra pair of hands, like me. I didn't have to fly the aeroplane right from the word go. But we got down to around about 26,000 feet, and the pressure leaked out of the aircraft, and we got to over 10,000 feet of cabin altitude, and we had to go onto oxygen on the flight deck. And as we went to put our masks on, mine went on all right. The engineer's, Barry's, his went on all right, and we made contact on the intercom. But the first officer's, as he pulled it down, the hose fell off, and there he was trying to mend it in his lap. And I had a brief chat with Barry, and I said, well, let's get down below 20,000 feet, and we can take our masks off as well. I'd made a decision we would take them off. We can be back as a crew again, as a threesome, because you need to be a crew and working together. He said, what a good idea. So I threw away this 6,000, 8,000 feet all in less than a minute. And I hadn't been there very long, below 20,000 feet, before he managed to mend his oxygen mask. So perhaps I was a bit hasty. However, we did get down under it a lot more quickly than we would have done if we just glided round.
And that was that was a gamble, wasn't it? Because
Well, it was a bit of a gamble because the height was valuable. In simple physics terms of physics, we were turning height, which was potential energy, into forward speed, which was kinetic energy, and that's what was keeping us flying in the air. And to throw away 6,000 or 7,000 feet is a big decision to make.
So you had...
Probably why my hair's white now.
You had 4 engines not working. You hadn't obviously quite worked out what was going on around you. And I guess, do you ever think of the passengers in these situations, or is what's happening down the back out of your mind while you're doing all of this?
Well, I'm afraid it's you're flying yourself, aren't you? It's the 4 inches of flesh that's most valuable to any pilot is his neck. And yes, of course, when you've got everything else dealt with, you do think of the passengers or what's going on behind you. I mean, you don't think of them in a sentimental way because you're worried about, your own neck.
So you're obviously frantically trying to restart engines, and then one comes back to life. That must have been a great feeling.
Yeah, it was a wonderful feeling to get one back to life. And it does, we were, I suppose, beginning to be resigned to having to be, to ditch this aeroplane. We hadn't given up. There was no way the 3 of us, not one of us, would have given up.
Right.
But we were